All right, we're going to talk about algebraic expressions today. But before I even talk about what algebraic expressions are, we're going to talk about the difference between expressions versus equations. So you guys are going to experience both of these things, expressions and equations. And you're going to have to know the difference between the two, okay? So expressions has, if I can spell, has no equal sign. While the equation has an equal sign. Okay, so that is very important. The next thing I want to talk about is the order of operations. That's the other vocab that you're going to need to know. Now, this is something that a lot of people make mistakes with. Okay? So that's the reason why we're talking about it. Now, you guys remember this as PEMDAS. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally is the other way. Okay? Now, you guys don't have a problem with the P, that's parentheses. You don't have the problem with the E because that's exponents. The problem that you guys typically have is this part here. What you have to understand is that the M and the D is multiplication and division. So you're going to multiply or divide. And the biggest part is that it's from left to right. Okay? And then similarly, this is addition, so you add or subtract from left to right. Okay? So that's very important. And this is where majority of people make the mistakes when they're dealing with expressions. Okay, and also equations. So the other thing I wanted to point out is this. So with multiplying, there's a couple of things that that you need to know with multiplying. So one of the things that we're going to talk about is the expressions. So you might see multiplying in different ways. So you might see something like, if I was just doing numbers, the multiplication symbol, 2 times 3. And you could also see things like 2 times 3, right, with that dot. Well, you can also see this if it was with variables, which is letters, and this is where the algebraic expression comes into play. And an algebraic expression that you might see is like 2 times, let's say, x. Okay, you might see that dot in the middle, but you might also not see the dot in the middle. That is also meaning multiplying. Okay, the reason why we have the x there is because number one, we don't want to confuse this multiplication symbol with this. That's number one. Number two, the x is there because the x is actually going to be a number. It just happens to be an unknown number, okay? So we have to understand the different forms of multiplying that we might see, all right? So that's one. Number two, let's use the blue. Dividing also has some tricks to it as well, okay? So dividing, you might see it as, just the division symbol, like 2 divided by 3. Or you might see it with variables where you can see it with the dividing symbol as well, but you can also see it as 2 divided by 3. Okay, so those are different ways of seeing dividing. And these obviously we call them fractions, which when you see a fraction, essentially we are dividing. Okay, so now that we've talked about that, so order of operation, parentheses, exponent, multiplication, division from left to right, addition, subtraction from left to right. So really it's just 4 steps, not the 6 steps that people think that they are. Okay, all right. So algebraic expression is just a mixture. So what can we do? With algebraic expressions. So that's the question. Well, there's several things that we can do. One is that we can evaluate them. Two, we can translate them. And the translate is basically putting words, we're translating words into those particular operations. But either way you do this, well, I wouldn't say either way. Translate don't usually is only a translate. But with evaluate, the thing that you're going to have to remember to do is you're going to have to number one, simplify. And that's something that you definitely want to do. But even before you simplify, you're going to also need to know how to substitute. So you're going to substitute, and then you're going to simplify. Okay, so that's what usually happens with evaluate. Translate is just literally converting words to those operations. Okay, and know when to use what variable or using a variable. Okay, so let's talk about. And with simplifying, there's going to be more down the road as we're going, all right? And those are all going to be under the category of simplifying, all right? All right, so let's talk about the first thing, which is evaluate. Okay, so typically what you would do is you'll have you'll be given something, like values of variables, and then you'll have to evaluate. And they'll give you where those numbers go. So for example, let's say that they give you that x is equal to 72 and y is equal to 9. So again, variable is just numbers. We just don't know what those numbers are. But in this case, we're going to be given the values of those numbers. All right. So it might tell you to evaluate x over y. So with that being said, what we would do, so before I even do that, let's do this. Let's call that red. So I want to also choose this to be red. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to substitute. Okay, so this step is where the substitute comes. We're going to put in the value for x, which is 72. We're going to put in the value for y, which is 9. And then from here, we would evaluate. Or I should say, is to simplify. Okay, so then that is going to be equal to just 8. And once I evaluate, that would be my answer. All right. Another example. So let's say we're given, excuse me, r is equal to 43, and that s is equal to 7. And then it wants you to evaluate r minus s over 6. So again, we're going to substitute. We know what the value of r is. R is 43. We know what the value of s is. It's 7 over 6. Whoa. All right. So from there, we go, okay. So now with these, you can't divide right away. What you have to understand is with the division bar, the way it is, since it's in fraction form, I would tell you to pretend that the top is essentially like a parentheses, okay? So that means we have to make the top as a single number first before we can actually divide. So it'd be 43 minus 7 first, which gives us 36, divided by 6, which gonna give me 9. Oh, sorry, not 9. What am I doing? How about let's try a different number like 6, all right? And then that would be your answer. 36 divided by 6 is equal to 6, okay? So that is essentially what we've talked about in terms of evaluating, okay? So the second part is to translate, actually. Is to translate So I wanted you guys to know the lingo that will be used in the homework. So translate to an algebraic expression. So what I want to do here is I want to put in a chart here that is talking about the different words versus its operation, okay? So if you notice, there goes your words, all right? So add to, sum, total, plus, more than, increase by, those are all addition types, okay? So if you need to refer back to this at some point, you're welcome to, during the homework, during the quiz, during the practice test, and the practice test homework. Obviously not on the test itself. The exams itself are going to be proctored, so you can't really have anything to basically help you with those, all right? So I want you to look at 3 of these, okay? More than, less than, and subtracted from. Now these 3 here are kind of special. So I want to use this highlighter here and put that down as a marker, or as they call it, a legend. Okay, so like more than. So if I said 7 more than a number, then what I would do is, first of all, a number here would be called a variable. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be X, it could be Y, it could be a Z, it could be an A, it could be a T, whatever you want. So let's call it T, okay? So more than, if you notice, more than, I know that this is, here, let me do it with a different color here. We know that more than means addition, okay? So when I write this, again, more than means addition, great. But I want you guys to know it's this. Notice how the positions are switched. Now you're gonna say, well, T plus 7 and 7 plus T are the same thing. You are absolutely right, all right? But my whole thing is that, and I'm gonna guess that My Last Plus will give you the credit for it. And the reason why I'm pointing this out to you is that if they use less than, you have to make that switch. Okay, if this was 7 less than a number, you'll have to write it as t minus 7. And if you wrote it as 7 minus t, that would be wrong. Subtracted from will be the same thing. If you think about subtracted from, right? If I told you to subtract your age, or how about this? Subtract 10 years from your age, right? You would put your age first and then minus 10. You want to do 10 minus your age and get a negative number, all right? So if you think of it that way, when you look at subtracted from, it will be pretty obvious that you put the last thing first and the first thing last. It's the same with more than and less than. Okay, I want you guys to understand that. All right, so let me insert another table here. And this table is something that we can actually go ahead and practice, or fill out, I should say. So let's make this a little bigger. Move this a little over a little more. There we go. All right, so 8 more than some number. Okay, so some number, we're gonna call that, I don't know, what do you want to call it? Let's call it a C, okay? So some number is a C, and we know that more than means to add, right? So in that case, I know that this answer is, and now again, more than, so it's going to be C plus 8, okay? 1/4 of a number. So again, I have of, which means to multiply. And then I have a number. And a number means I gotta choose a variable. Let's say B. Okay? And then we have 1/4 of, so it means it's gonna be 1/4 times B. Now, I could also write this as 1/4 B with no dot in the middle, okay? All right, so same thing in the next one. We have 2 more than 4 times some number. So the sum number is, let's call it, you want to call it A? So let's call it A times, we have 2 things here. We got times, which means to multiply. And we also have more than, which means to add. But also, with the adding, we're going to have to flip-flop this first part with the second part. Okay, those got to be switched. So how do I write 4 times a number? Okay, so to write 4 times a number would be 4 times the number A, and then we have more than 2. There you go. All right, so I wrote the last part first and the first part last. Okay, so let's look at this one here. 8 less than some number. Less than means what? Subtraction. Awesome. I have some number. So I got to pick a variable. Let's say X. And again, this is less than means I got to switch the first and the last part. So I'm going to write the last part first. So X minus 8. 5 less than the product of 2 numbers. Okay, so I have 2 numbers. All right. And then again, I have 2 operations here, product and less than. Less than means to subtract, but I have to switch the first and the last. And product means to multiply. So again, I would cover up the 5 less than first and say, okay, I need to find the product of 2 numbers. Well, those 2 numbers is 2 numbers. Now, I don't know if they're the same numbers or different numbers, and I can't assume that they're the same. So for me, I can't use the same variable, okay? If I call those 2 numbers, let's say y and y, then I'm assuming those 2 are the same numbers, all right? So I can't do that. I can use y, but that means I have to use a different variable, let's say z, okay? So let's call those 2 numbers at y and z. So I want the product of the 2. Well, to do the product of the 2, it'd be y times z, okay? Less than 5. So notice how I wrote the second part first and wrote the first part last, all right? Okay. We have 25% of some number. 25% of some number. So first of all, we have some number. Okay, oops, that has to be green. So I got some number. So we got to pick a variable for that. Let's see, let's call it t. Okay, 25%. Now, 25%, we can't write this 25% as 25% and then, of some number, right? But before we do that, I also have to point out to you what the operation is. The operation is of, which means to multiply, okay? So 25%, we can change that to a decimal, okay? So you're wondering how. So let's talk about that really quick, all right? So if I have decimal, which starts with D, and then we say we want in percent P, okay? So decimal is D, P stands for percent, and in fact, let's do it this way. Okay, so again, if you don't know which order is in the alphabetical order, D is the left, P is the right for percent, okay? So to do this, what we have to do is changing either way. If I go from decimal to percent, I would go 2 decimals to the right. If I go from percent to decimal, then I go 2 places to the left, okay? So 25%, so again, let me do this. So if I have 25%, what this means is that I have 25 period. And since I'm changing it from a percent to a decimal, that means I gotta move the decimal place to the left. So when I move the decimal place to the left, I'm gonna move it 2 positions to the left. So there's going to be my new decimal place. So then what I have is 0.25, you can put a 0 right there to make sure that I see the point, times that t, okay? Next one, 7 less than 3 times some number, okay? So less than is one of them, times is another. Less than means to subtract, and times means to multiply. And then we have some number. Let's see, what do we want to call that? We use X, Y, Z, A, B, C. You want to use, let's use D. Okay? All right, so less than means to subtract, however, it includes switching the front and the back. Okay, so let's look at the back. It says 3 times some number. So I got 3 times some number D less than 7. Okay, so notice what I've done. What I've done so far is that I read the whole thing. I found my operations, I found where I have to insert variables. When I say sum or a number, I just use one variable. If it tells me that there's two numbers, then I have two variables, two different variables. You could have used a and z, a and b, x and y, b and y. It doesn't really matter, but it has to be two different variables. Then I go, okay, because it says less than, that means I gotta write the second part first. So I went and wrote the second part first. In other words, I went bits and pieces. I didn't try to read that whole thing and then went and drew out the algebraic expression. So one of the other things you can do also, number one, the first part I do recommend, strongly recommend. I read and then broke them down to pieces and let those pieces dictate where they're supposed to go. And then second part is this. Second part is that what you can do is look at your expression that you wrote. Like let's say the last one, 3 times d minus 7. So you read again, 7 less than 3 times some number doesn't make sense. Can you see it correlate with each other? If it does, then you most likely have the correct answer. Okay, so that's what I would say to you. And these are the two most important things that you're going to be doing in algebraic expressions. All right, there's going to be order operations. You're going to have to evaluate and simplify. In other words, with evaluating algebraic expressions, you had to substitute and you had to simplify. Okay, where with translate, you had to translate words. So you're going to break these words into pieces and then kind of put them back together with numbers and variables. All right, if you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of me.